Take Me Through It is made possible by people like you. Thank you for downloading, listening, and subscribing. And leave us a comment on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.
1957.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
The Soviets beat us in round one of the space race with Sputnik.
Number one, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons.
1962. President Kennedy promises to put an American on the moon.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And 1969, as America holds its breath.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
America's fascination with space may not be what it was back in the 1960s, but the hard work, the discoveries, the march of human achievement continues. As Elton John once sang, and all this science I don't understand. It's just my job 5 days a week. Well, it's not my job, but this time on Take Me Through It, we'll talk to a man who does have the job of studying the effects of space travel on human beings, and I guarantee you it will be fascinating. Dr. Mark Shelhamer of Johns Hopkins University joins us this time on Take Me Through It. Dr. Mark Shelhamer is Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins Medical School. He took a leave from his academic position from 2013 to 2016 to serve as NASA's Chief Scientist for Human Research at the Johnson Space Center. Dr. Mark Shelhamer, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And also joining us today is from the Take Me Through It Research Department, Mike Fennell. Mike.
How are you, everybody?
Thank you all for joining us. Mark, you took that academic leave to study the impact that space travel has on human beings. What are some of the key findings that you found?
Yeah, well, let me step back and correct your question to some extent. That's what I thought I was doing, was taking a leave to study these things. In fact, what I was doing was taking leave to oversee the people who study these things. It's, as they described it, it's a senior management position as chief scientist. So although I was nominally a scientist, in fact, I was a science manager, which has its ups and downs, and certainly I have a lot to say about that. Stepping into a management role as a practicing scientist, and then coming back the reverse. But I certainly got to oversee a much broader range of science than I would ever have experienced or known about in my own little area of sensory motor research and vestibular research. So back to your question, which was...
What did you find in the study or management of studies of human impact, the impact on humans of space travel?
Well, a lot of stuff happens when you send people into space, and for a variety of reasons, I suppose, we don't hear about it too much anymore. You know, it's not exactly routine even now to send people into space, even though about 500 people have gone into space already. Professional astronauts mostly, but not completely. And I still say we as if I'm at NASA, but we as a community, a space biomedical community, have a lot of that stuff under control. But still, there's two things impressed me during my NASA experience that weren't really that apparent to me before. First of all, it seems that every time you send people into space for a longer period of time or on a different, more ambitious mission, you find something else happening to them. Some other physiological, psychological, behavioral little aspect comes up that, like, oh, I wish we had seen that coming, you know. And then they're not debilitating, they're not showstoppers, but they make you wonder when you take the next big leap for a Mars mission, for example, for 3 years. It makes you wonder what you're going to see. The other thing that impressed me was the interconnection of things. As a typical bench researcher, as we're called, me and my colleagues, we're used to studying our little area, and we know that our little area connects to all the other areas of physiology and psychology and performance. But generally, we're paid and rewarded for making progress in our own little area. So it struck me, since I was in a position to oversee all these different things and how they connect, it struck me, first of all, how little the different areas of physiology, psychology, performance, behavior are, how little they are studied the interconnections are studied in a systematic fashion for a number of reasons. So as a science manager, I tried to fix that to some extent. There's a lot of inertia involved that makes it difficult to do that. And now back as a researcher, I'm trying to draw on that experience in my own research and try to connect the variety of physiological and psychological disciplines in my own work. It's not easy.
No, I can't imagine that it is. I think one of the most public components of what's been going on over the past couple of years is the study of the twins, Mark and Scott Kelly. Scott was up in space for, I believe, 340 days between 2015 and 2016, while his twin brother, Mark, stayed on the ground. And there were some very specific investigations that you led to see what kind of impact there was on Scott when he was in orbit as compared to it was with Mark when he wasn't.
Right. Don't get me into trouble with my colleagues now by saying I led them. Or say I oversaw them.
You oversaw them.
Some extent. But we had a very prestigious group of 10 principal investigators and their groups.
And it should be clarified that because they're twins, they're genetically identical.
Exactly.
That's the control aspect.
That was right. That was the whole point of it. And Mark Kelly, who stayed on the ground, is a retired astronaut. So that was really the key to the whole thing. And as the story goes, these stories tend to take on some legendary tones after a while. But as the story goes, at some point, the twins actually approached NASA and said, "Hey, we're twins and one of us is flying and the other is not. Are you going to do anything with that?" So, look at you have a built-in control of a genetic, somebody genetically identical to the person going into space. And so, NASA said, well, of course we're going to do something about that. And they put together the so-called twins study. And let me tell you a little something about that, because I was involved in not the solicitation, but the selection process for what things we actually flew and making a cohesive, coherent scientific package of a number of different investigations. And I was really concerned that when we started to do the grant reviews, you call in panels of outside experts, and it's a very formal and very involved process to do this correctly. And NASA takes this very, very seriously to be able to get the best science. I really was worried that we were going to get panels of experts in transcriptomics and genomics and proteomics, all these different omics areas. And they would just laugh at us and basically say, this is great. You're going to send one person into space, one person on the ground, a very poorly controlled study full of scientific confounds. The person on the ground, Mark Kelly, isn't eating the same stuff that his brother in space is eating. No way. For 340 days. He's not going to be exercising necessarily the same amount, 2 hours a day, which they do in space. They may be genetically identical to start with, but so many things are going to be different other than just being in space. And, now you're calling in this panel of outside scientific experts to help you, NASA, make sense of this thing, which is just a complete screw up from the start. That's what I was concerned about. In fact, that's not what happened. They came in and said, yeah, we realize that there are shortcomings to this study. Basically, we give them some credit for trying to do the best they can here, and we as reviewers will help you get the best science for this, all recognizing that there are tremendous numbers of shortcomings to this study, because it's only one set of twins and lots of confounds. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how this kind of came about and the background of it.
So what were the key takeaways, the discoveries from this test?
Some I don't know. Some I can't tell you, even if I did know. But the publications are starting to come out now. Has a little bit of background. Privacy and confidentiality is a huge issue in any type of biomedical experiment. This is a special case, obviously, because you can publish a paper saying subject X and his or her identical twin, subject Y, were studied in this scientific investigation, and subject X spent 340 days in space. You know who these people are, right? There's no point in even pretending. So to their credit, the twins in this case have basically signed off and said, yeah, we know that we're going to be identifiable by the time you publish these studies. So I'm going to say I don't know on the bigger picture all of the answers to that. I'll tell you one thing that I do know that is coming out is that it seems that the finding seems to be that telomeres, which are the ends of the DNA on DNA strands that get shorter every time there is a cell replication. So it's a sign of aging if your telomeres get shorter, basically. Those seem to actually, or under stressful environments, they tend to get shorter. I think I got the science right on this. That mechanism seems to have been reversed in Scott Kelly, who flew. Yeah, makes no sense. You're looking at me quizzically, and it's exactly the opposite of what you would expect.
Well, if I were a science fiction writer, I would take the leap and say that means Scott's getting younger the more time he spends in space. Is that way off base?
That would be your initial finding, and that's an interesting hypothesis. Well, you're unloading the body, so in some sense, and arguably have a more nutritious. What you eat in space is not only is it tracked very tightly, but it's designed very carefully so that you have the right meet your nutritional requirements. It's a very demanding environment in space. And they're exercising routinely 2 hours a day, every day, except I think one day on the weekend. So in some ways, it's a pretty healthy environment, but in other ways, it's a really demanding environment. Their sleep schedules are generally pretty screwed up. Fluid is generally shifting toward the head because of there's no net gravity vector. It's the workload is very high. You're in a small space with other people for long periods of time. So it's tempting to say, yeah, there's a sign that must be something healthy about this environment that's reversing the process. But in most ways, it's a very demanding environment that it's actually been likened to accelerated aging, because if you don't do the exercise, you lose bone mineral density, for example, equivalent to aging a few years on Earth. So I don't know. The bottom line is I can argue it either way, but it's just two people so far. Right. But it means this is really interesting and unexpected, and it has to be validated and verified and repeated and see if we can understand it. And it's an early finding. Right. So let's not read too much into it, but it's intriguing.
I love reading way too much into many things. That's what I love to do. Is the key component then weightlessness? Because I'm thinking, okay, 2 hours of exercise, how do you create the resistance if there's some kind of weight training? How do you do that in space?
Oh, well, they use the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, the ARED, on the space station. Yes,
those upstairs.
That's right, exactly.
And if we were on TV rather than radio or the equivalent, I could show you the picture of it. But you can go to the NASA website and picture it. It's a resistive device, so you can apply resistance in a number of ways. You don't need it to be through weight per se. You just push against something that has basically kind of reverse shock absorbers in it that provide viscous damping that make it hard to push. There's also a treadmill on the space station, and there's also, I believe, a cycle ergometer. So by the time they do all of these things, they have aerobic exercise, they have resistive exercise. Many of them are in in terms of some muscle strength and bone density, some of them are in better shape when they come back than when they went.
Well, because of that intensive exercise
Not
regimen,
every
probably.
not every astronaut exercises 2 hours a day on Earth, believe it or not. You know, they're all healthy and fit, but they're not all super athletes. They're all in better shape than any of us here, but
Well, they're astronauts.
they're astronauts. Exactly, they're astronauts.
They have the right stuff.
So even a couch potato astronaut is in pretty good shape.
The long-term impact, just from some of these basic studies, of all this time that people spend in space. You know, Vice President Pence recently in a Wall Street Journal, also when he reopened the National Space Council, talked about we are going back to the moon and we are going to Mars. And there have been some scientific advances that suggest that we might be able to go to Mars in 20 years. And do you feel that the research on humans is far enough along to say, okay, that's a reasonable goal? It looks like the technology is limitless and we'd be able to do it. But do you want to put a human being in there and send him or her or they to Mars for, first of all, it's going to take forever to get there. I don't know how long it'll take.
3 years? Is it 3 years?
6 to 9 months to get there.
Oh, okay.
And same on
the mission would
back.
be 3 years.
But the mission would be 3 years because you have to wait for the planets to align properly before you come back.
Right.
Or else you don't have the propulsion capability to come back.
Do you see, this is really just your opinion, do you see man on the moon again soon and man on Mars within the next 20 or even 30 years?
Well, wait a minute. Which question do you want me to answer?
Let's go with question one, man on the moon, our return.
No, let me answer your other question.
Okay, answer the other question.
No, because I'm intrigued by your first where you're going with the first question, because I was intrigued by it because you had it backwards. Because I think you asked something to the effect that will we know enough? Do we really think we're going to know enough to send people to Mars in 20 years or something like that?
Let's start there.
And and that intrigued me because almost by definition, our jobs in the human research program, which that's where I was the chief scientist for a few years, the goal was, the marching orders were this: NASA is going to send people to Mars in about 20 years. We think that was the general plan at the time, and so in order to do that, we need to be able to say yes or no in about 10 years as to whether we're ready to send humans to Mars in 20 years in terms of maintaining their health and performance and psychology, physiology, medical conditions, all of that stuff. So it's almost by definition, we'll be ready to send people in 20 years. Just like how bad is it? How much are we going to be able to mitigate the risks in that amount of time? So NASA, through the Human Research Program, is doing a lot of experiments on the ground, but also a lot of things on the International Space Station, which is good for about another 7 to 10 years to be able to do that. So I don't know, that I think addresses your first question, which is we think we could send humans to Mars now. It's just that it wouldn't be very pretty. You know, they wouldn't be at their best. They would take a hit in their performance and their physiology and their health. They may come back in pretty bad shape. And, you know, you're sending them there not just to get them there and back. You're sending them there to do a year and a half worth of useful work, useful, demanding work, which requires putting on a bulky spacesuit and going outside and working and being mentally capable and dealing with the unexpected and things like that. So the idea isn't just to survive, it's to really do work. So in that sense, there's a lot more work to be done to enable that.
For decades, America's participation in the space race, as they called it when I was growing up, really captured the hearts of the American public. When Sputnik went up 60 years ago, we were devastated. And then John Glenn came along. Then President Kennedy says, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And then Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, among others. We had the space shuttle, which was a great innovation to see a space rocket take off like a rocket and land like an airplane. And then, of course, a couple of tragedies there. Do you think NASA can or will recapture that attention from the American people. I know funding is a big part of it, but it's something about capturing the heart of the American people that so many of us in our generation, that was part of it. We stopped what we were doing on July 20th, 1969 to watch Neil Armstrong. That was a unifying, patriotic, proud moment for every American. Do you ever see something like that coming back in this country, and as a trip to Mars the only thing that'll do it?
I don't know if a trip to Mars will do it. I don't know. I mean, I want to be a little bit cynical and say the answer to your question is no, which is not necessarily bad. So, give a little perspective on this. From my point of view, I don't know who it was who said it. It may have been Norman Mailer, somebody said, the American people will rise to any occasion once. Right? I mean,
Great line.
World War II, and then Korea, Vietnam after that. I mean, there's lots of arguments on all sides. Those are complicated issues. But, the idea is like, we did that. We did the space thing and we won. Not that it's not exciting. I mean, has somebody, I think Norm Augustine said, there's two things that continue to fascinate kids these days. That's dinosaurs and space. And I ain't seen too many dinosaurs lately. So, and it's true, when I give a talk to an audience that includes students, students come up to me later. How can I get involved in this? Do you have research going on in your lab? Can I be a part of this? Not all of them, not everybody. Some people are skeptical and don't want to have anything to do with it. But it's just inherently cool sending people into space. It's demanding. It's captivating. It challenges people to do their best in a demanding environment. That doesn't mean that it has to be another Apollo program. I think sometimes the mistake people make is saying that everything has to be that kind of thing, that kind of supranational effort, like a Manhattan Project, like an Apollo program. You could make the argument. I'm fascinated by the Apollo program too. I think it's amazing. It's probably the most amazing thing that people have ever done. I'm endlessly fascinated by it. But you could make the case that was the wrong way to establish a space program, because now everybody expects it to be another Apollo program. And if it's not, well, what's NASA doing? Well, NASA's sending people into space all the time. We have had continuous occupation of the International Space Station for over 15 years, probably 17 or so by now. I mean, continuous human presence in space. People are routinely on the International Space Station for 6 months at a time, 6 people at any given time. You never hear about that. Now, does that mean NASA's failing because it's not another Apollo program with all the glamour of that? Or are they succeeding because they're doing the hard work of making sure people can survive in space so that they can go to someplace like the moon or Mars? It's an open question. Yes, I rue the fact that it doesn't have the glamour and the glitz and the public attention and all that stuff that the Apollo days had, because it would make my life more interesting as well, since I'm involved in it. On the other hand, it doesn't mean it's not important just because it's not getting publicity.
One might argue that we have enough problems here on the planet to go up, but then again, in the 1960s, there was no more tumultuous time in our history, and that was the height of our space exploration, as we were dealing with Vietnam, civil rights protests and assassinations. I mean, there wasn't anything crazier than the 1960s, and there we were leading the world in the space race.
Yep. I know. That's a common argument. We have enough problems here to solve. Why are we sending people into space? But it's a specious argument. It's like saying, I have to get my house in perfect order and finish all my work tasks before I can take a vacation. I mean, I'm not equating going into space with taking a vacation, but I'm saying there's a mix of events in your personal life and a mix of activities in the life of the nation, let's say, is healthy. So let me this is great because I can give you a plug for a paper that I wrote that just was published this very week.
Plug away.
In the famous journal Space Policy, which I'm afraid
who doesn't have a subscription to
yeah,
that?
I'm afraid you're not going to find at your local newsstand.
Right next to the Mad magazine.
Yeah, and I didn't have the money to be able to publish it open access. So you actually have to pay money to find the article, or email me and maybe I can send you a PDF of it. But anyway, I addressed some of these things. The article is basically trying to make a point, weigh in yet again on this argument of why we send people into space. I took it largely from the scientific perspective, but at some point I had to address some of these kinds of issues of what are the counter arguments. But here's one of the examples that I came up with. Both Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, Amazon fame, specifically have cited the Apollo program as one of the things that gave them the motivation, the excitement, just as it did for me, to get into science and engineering and to say, wow, that's really cool. Look at the things you can accomplish with a technical, scientific engineering effort. It's really amazing. And it was, motivating. And so you could say, yeah, okay, but you don't need space flight to do that, and a lot of things could do. But point being, in those particular circumstances, that space flight is what did it. It's motivating in a unique way that I think few other things are. Now, these days, there's lots of things that are motivating like that. There's alternative energy, which is very exciting. There's virtual reality things, which are
we're just gonna let the phone
very exciting. It doesn't bother me.
Telemarketers. Curse the telemarketers.
That's somebody
now
calling.
That's something you have to explore. Telemarketing and how to
get that going in space. Exactly. How do we get those calls into the International Space Station to ask people for money?
That's somebody calling for a copy of my article.
There you go. Well, exactly. We'll take callers a little bit.
That didn't take long.
Give me the name of that article and where we can find it one more time.
Well, I forget the exact name. I could look it up, but it's like scientific and non-scientific motivations for sending people into space or something like that. But if you look at if you search under my name in space policy, it'll come up pretty quickly. Or if you email me at my Johns Hopkins address, I could give you a copy.
Okay, and it's Mark Shelhamer, Shelhamer.
Yeah, well, it would be mshelhamer at jhu.edu.
Okay, great. Do that. I want to go back a little bit. You mentioned something about weight. We talked a little bit about weightlessness. Mm-hmm. Have you experienced, and this isn't too personal a question, is it? Have you experienced weightlessness?
Yes, I haven't. So you're setting me up. Yes, I have. I've had the good fortune to fly the Vomit Comet parabolic flight.
We have to get on that mic. We get the Vomit.
I know. I would love to do that.
Yeah. If there is any opportunity. Now, I was really lucky. Really, first of all, the first time I did it was 1984 as a graduate student. And I got off the plane the first time, and we were scheduled to do it for 2 weeks, 4 days a week for 2 weeks for experiments. We were developing space lab experiments, how people adapt to zero-G, and we were running people through a small version of that. You get 25 seconds or so of weightlessness at a time, and I was running it as an operator. And I got off the plane the first time, and I said, I'm done. I'm not going to do this. I was sick halfway through, and it's not pleasant. Hey, it doesn't kill you, but it's not pleasant. And then, I got up the next day, sun shining, I'm looking around, I survived this thing. Let's give it another shot. And I got sick at the very end of the flight. And after that, it was fine. So I got hooked on this. I love it. Roller coasters scare me to death. I am not kidding. I will not do them. Ask my wife. I do not find that pleasant at all. Spinning things, except for the slow rotating room thing that we've been talking about earlier today. But I don't do, merry-go-rounds and that kind of stuff. Really, I'm very susceptible to motion sickness. But parabolic flight is 25 seconds at a time of zero-G. I love it. I really got hooked on this.
And
it is
just
great.
In a room.
Well, it's an airplane,
right.
And so it's. NASA used to run it. It was a KC-135, which is basically a military 707. Then they started contracting with Zero-G Corporation. Give them a little plug, and for them it's I believe a 727, and they still contract with them. And there's a few other companies around to do it. NASA got out of the business of doing it themselves. They no longer run their own parabolic flight program, which for various reasons, privatized it, so they now contract with some other agency. So you can do it. You can do it either as if you find somebody like me who's running experiments on people in parabolic flight. You can be a test subject, or
sound effects are
yeah
are provided by our intern Mason. He's our four-legged.
He's digging up the bones.
Okay, it's all right. It's a casual conversation.
Oh, it doesn't bother me.
He's just
nesting. He's just
nesting.
There we
He's
go.
nesting. He heard us talking about going to Mars, and he's thinking,
He wants to get on a parabolic flight, so he's trying to be friends with me. He's curled up against my foot here, and I don't blame him, because it is a great deal of fun.
That's right.
So
I can imagine it.
So it's right. So it's a fuselage, and they take out most of the seats. So there's a lot of open space. All the seats are at the end, and they'll fly about 20, 25 people on a flight. But you unless you're going as a tourist, which you can do. I don't know what Zero G charges. Go to their website. It's like $6,000 for a flight. Like I said, I was lucky because I basically got paid to do it as a researcher, and I had to do it over and over and over again to do the experiments. But I had a job to do as well. Sometimes I was a test subject. Most of the times I was an operator. Later on, when I became a faculty member and it was my own projects, I was smart enough to design the things so that I just had to oversee the projects. So as long as everything was going well, I had time to enjoy the environment. But that's legitimate because I'm a researcher investigating people's responses to weightlessness. So I thought it was fair for me to experience it myself and note my responses. It's hard for me to imagine people studying astronauts in space without having experienced at least some of that themselves. It is, I call it a singularity, I mean, in the sense that you can go on a centrifuge and experience hyper G, higher G levels, and you can do various manipulations, experience intermediate lower G levels in a plane, for example. A plane or a roller coaster, it goes over that top. You feel like your stomach is coming up. You're experiencing a little bit of reduced G, maybe even zero G. But to experience it for 25 seconds at a time, over and over again, it's nothing else like it.
I can imagine. Let's talk a little bit about private space exploration.
Right.
Elon Musk and SpaceX, just this week, he was talking about this humongous reusable rocket he has an idea for. It's called the Interplanetary Transport System. It would go 18,000 miles per hour. He says it could even be used on Earth, so you can get from New York to Shanghai in 39 minutes. I mean, is that, first of all, first question, private space exploration. We're heading in that direction on many levels, aren't we?
We're there now. I mean, SpaceX and orbital ATKs are contracted by NASA to send cargo ships up to the space station.
Any human cargo on these?
Not that they're saying, but not yet. But that's clearly where they're going. I mean, SpaceX has made this very apparent, and so has Jeff Bezos, Blue Origin, and they're not the only ones. But those are the most vocal about it, and probably the furthest advanced. But we're talking there about orbital space flight, sending people into space, into orbit, to a space station or something, and including potential commercial space stations. Bigelow Aerospace, for example, is planning on building a private commercial space station. Sounds crazy, except he has a module right now. It's an inflatable module. You send it up, has kind of a deflated balloon, and it gets inflated once you send it into space, so the volume is much smaller when you launch it. He has a module attached to the International Space Station right now. So this is reality. This is stuff that's going to happen. It's not a space station yet that you can send people to. So it's going to happen, almost undoubtedly. There will be problems along the way, almost undoubtedly. The other one is Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, but Virgin Galactic will be sending people on suborbital space flights pretty soon.
Is it worth the risk and worth the money?
That's a calculation everybody has to make on their own.
That is some very cool stuff we're hearing from Dr. Mark Shelhamer. So cool, in fact. We're going to continue the conversation in our next episode. We're going to hear from Mike Fennell, Vice President of Research here at Take Me Through It, and of course Mason, the four-legged intern. And we're going to talk about sending a man to Mars, radiation, and Buddy Rich. That's right, Buddy Rich, that Buddy Rich. It's a fascinating conversation, part 2 coming up in our next episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please tell all your friends about us and subscribe, and send us a comment on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm BJ Fennell. Thanks for joining. Take Me Through It is a production of Fennell Communications, LLC.